Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the policy seminar on building resilience to prevent food crisis and conflicts. My name is Rob Vos. I'm the Director of Markets, Trade and Institutions of the International Food Policy Research Institute, and I will be your moderator today. This event is co-organized by the International Food Policy Research Institute, the Food Security Information Network, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the World Food Programme, and the Food Security Portal. The key background to this event is the latest global report on food crisis, jointly prepared by 16 organizations that are united in the Food Security Information Network. The report informs the work of the Global Network Against Food Crisis, about which we will hear more in the course of this seminar. According to the report, the latest report, an alarming 150 million people faced crisis level or worse of levels of acute food insecurity and needing immediate food assistance to survive. Several hundreds of thousands of these people faced actual famine. These numbers are on the rise. The COVID-19 pandemic clearly worsened conditions, but also last year, the key drivers of the major food crisis in the world were conflict and extreme weather events. We expect also that conflict will continue to be a main factor driving food crisis, exacerbated in most contexts by, again, extreme weather and the economic consequences of the continued COVID-19 pandemic. Most food crises are protected and have severely eroded the resilience of agricultural and food systems. Severe and protected food insecurity, in turn, also tends to fuel conflict, civil strife in these fragile contexts. If current trends are not reversed, food crisis and with it conflict will increase in frequency and severity. There's just an urgent need to step up efforts to build more resilient agri-food systems that are socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable. But doing so will not be easy. This policy seminar will focus on experiences and strategies that help build food system resilience and prevent conflict at the same time. To discuss this, we have an impressive lineup of expert speakers to engage with you today. We'll have first opening remarks by Dr. Johan Swinnen, the Director General of IFPRI. And then we have the presentation of the key findings of the global report by Domenica Sarella of the Food and Security Information Network, together with Lavinia Antonacci, who's of the Secretariat of the Global Network Against Food Crises. That introduction of the key findings of the report will be followed by two keynote addresses by international actors very active in programs and actions to helping to combat the food crisis, respectively Giampiero Mucci of the European Commission and Jim Barnard, the head of the Bureau of Resilience and Food Security of USAID. The keynote addresses will be followed by a panel discussion with 6 experts active in early warning, early action systems to prevent and address food crisis, and in research for the better design of responses to food crisis. We will hear from them what the challenges are and what the options are for solutions. I'll introduce them once they take the floor. After those interventions, there will be ample space for interaction with you, the audience. And we'll close the seminar with a wrap-up by the new director of the FAO office in Washington, Ms. Jocelyn Brown Hall. So before I give the floor to the first speaker, let me advise you that you can, during the entire seminar, place your questions and comments in chat boxes through ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter and whatever, depending on whichever media you use to connect to this seminar. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Jo Swinnen, the Director General of IFPRI, to give us some welcome and introductory remarks to the seminar. Jo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob, and welcome to everybody on the panel and to those of you who are listening to us. You know, I was in preparation of this meeting and my introduction. I actually just checked on the website, and it's almost 40 years ago. It was actually on 30 July 1983 that Bob Geldof of the Irish band, the Boomtown Rats, if you remember, organized Live Aid at Wembley Stadium. For those of you of my generation or older, or maybe also the younger generation, we hope this would be the last time that an event like that would have to be organized to address the stark problems of famines in the world. And although over the past decades we've made tremendous progress in reducing hunger and malnutrition, here we are again in 2021, almost 40 years later, and facing famines again in the world. The number of people who are facing acute food insecurity and needing urgent livelihoods support has hit a 5-year high in 2020. This is concluded by the Global Report Against Food Crisis, a report which has now come out several years in a row and which is playing a very important role of pointing out these major problems in the world. It's published by the Food Security Information Network for the Global Network Against Food Crises. It also brings out some of the causes of these acute food insecurity problems. There are conflict, there are economic shocks, they're weather-related. As Rob has emphasized already, some of it has to do with COVID, some of it has not to do with COVID. But in any case, it is pushing many millions of people into acute food insecurity. 2020 is not an exception. I mean, the numbers have been on the rise for several years now, at least since the mid of the last decade, and it is a very, very, very worrisome trend. Geographically, it's mainly concentrated in Africa. 2 out of 3 people who are facing acute food insecurity are based in Africa, but there are many countries across the world who are suffering from the same problems. As Rob already explained in his introductory remark, the food crises which are leading to this acute food security are protracted. Okay, they're not just a one-off event, a one-month event or something, which means that they probably cannot be resolved by humanitarian aid alone. So we need to find more structural solutions that think of lines along the corridor or the nexus of humanitarian assistance, development, peace building activities, all coming together and reinforcing each other. We also know that many of these conflicts are actually concentrated in rural areas, and that food insecurity is not only a consequence of conflict, it's also a cause of conflict. So we have to look into the complexities of these and to focusing on the location where the activities are developing and leading to these major problems. We are really treasuring in this work we are doing at IFPRI, we are treasuring the collaboration with all the agencies in the Food Security Information Network. They include many people who are on the program today, such as FAO, World Food Programme, FuseNet, but also many, more than a dozen other agencies which are involved. They are producing the Global Report on Food Crisis, as I mentioned already, and this has become a key reference for identifying food crises and their main problems. And so we hope to support these activities going in the future. It is also an important input in the global network against food crisis, and the European Commission and USAID are really important agencies supporting this network, and they will contribute their views as well on the program today. Finally, let me just relate some of the discussions of today with really important other activities. One is on the United Nations Food System Summit. Later in the year, and together with many of the partners again today on the panel, are working in preparation of the Food System Summit to come up with ideas, not just for solving structural food insecurity in the future, but also acute food insecurity in the future. IFPRI itself is undergoing major restructuring right now as part of the One CGIAR developments, and so also there we hope to invest very significantly in building our capacity to address resilience of food systems in the future, resilience against some of the issues, the problems that we're discussing here today. And finally, let me point you out to the food security portal at IFPRI's website, where there is a lot of information in terms of early warning systems, early action systems for addressing food crisis going forward. We have a very impressive panel here, and so I'm giving the floor to them now, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Jo, for those introductory remarks and setting the stage. So let us now hear from the key findings from the Global Report on Food Crisis of 2021. And for that, I'm going to give the floor to Domenica Sabella, who's of the Secretariat of the Food Security Information Network, and Lavinia Tonazzi, who's of the Technical Support Unit of the Global Network Against Food Crisis, to introduce the key findings of the report. Over to you, Domenica and Lavinia.
Thank you, Rob. So my name is Domenica Sabella, and I'm the FSIN Communications Officer. I'm incredibly pleased to be here today to provide some insights into the Global Report on Food Crises 2021, or affectionately, as it's also known, the GRFC 2021. So the GRFC on its surface is actually a compilation of food security and nutrition analyses. And it is also a document of reference for the international community. But the GRFC is also the culmination of a consultative, consensus-based process between 16 different partner organizations, which are visible towards the bottom of the PowerPoint presentation. So you might be asking yourself then, what does the report actually do? Well, it provides an overview of the numbers of acutely food insecure people who needed urgent humanitarian assistance at the absolute worst point in the year. And for the report, we focused on countries where local capacities had already been exceeded and external assistance was requested. The information in the actual report is based on two sources, the IPC and the Cadre Harmonisé, also referred to as the CH. In some cases, however, we used IPC compatible sources. So for instance, FuseNet analyses, some of the WFP analyses and HNOs. In total, this resulted in the selection of 55 countries and territories being included in the report. And on the screen, you can actually see the different phase classifications, which go from 1 to 5. So we found that in these 55 countries and territories, there were 155 million people in crisis or worse. So thinking back to the previous slide, IPC-CH phases 3, 4, or 5, and that's for 2020. In terms of numbers alone, that actually is about half of the entire US population. The 155 million people is also representative of an increase of 20 million people from 2019. And the share of the analyzed population in crisis or worse was also increased from 2019 to 2020. We saw some of the biggest increases in numbers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Northern Nigeria, Syria, and Sudan. However, there is one important caveat that while, yes, these increases did reflect the worsening levels of acute food insecurity, they were also representative of wider geographical coverage of the actual analyses. So in very simple and plain terms, we basically have a situation that deteriorated or got worse, but we also ended up having more information for the 2021 report. Namely, we had information for places which we previously had no information for, urban centers, for instance. So in terms of what this looks like regionally, nearly 100 million people in IPCCH's phases 3, 4, or 5 were actually in Africa. And again, here's the regional breakdown. But ultimately, the question then becomes, what is actually at the root of all of this. What is fueling food crises? Well, this isn't a surprise to many people. There are actually three primary drivers: conflict, economic shocks, which includes COVID-19, and weather extremes. And here there is a breakdown of where the people basically were in which countries. So for instance, conflict was the main driver in the 55 countries. Economic shocks became more significant in 2020 as the indirect impact of COVID-19 exacerbated fragilities. Heavy rains caused flooding, which often led to destruction and displacement in most of the food crisis countries and territories in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. But we also had a very overactive hurricane season, which brought on flooding and drought, which of course contributed then to the precipitous rise in acute food insecurity in parts of Central America and Haiti. We shouldn't forget displacement and the role of displacement in all of this. So whether people are internally displaced or refugees, we have extremely troubling statistics on the number of displaced people in crises. We know that displacement exacerbates the underlying causes of malnutrition, limited access and availability of food, child feeding practices. We also know that refugees' ability to actively source employment and healthy diets was severely constrained in 2020 by the impact of COVID-19, but as well as the ongoing legal restrictions on refugee rights. We do know that of the 30.5 million refugees and asylum seekers in the world, nearly 38% actually originate just from 3 countries: Syria, 6.7 million, Afghanistan, 3 million, South Sudan, 2.3 million. So in many respects, COVID has actually made a very worrying situation go from bad to worse. Specifically for children, their malnutrition situation depicted in the GRFC is also incredibly concerning. We know that children living in food crisis countries and territories are especially vulnerable to malnutrition. In the 55 countries and territories, 15.8 million children under 5 were wasted, while roughly 75 million children were stunted. And we also know that research shows malnutrition has long-term effects in the development of children, but also in the development of communities. And with those important bits of information and highlights regarding the global report, I will turn over to my co-presenter, Lavinia, who will now do a bit more of a drill down into some of the actual findings of the GRFC. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Domenica, and let me now just 1 second, I can share the screen as soon as you, okay. Great, okay. So yes, as Domenica said, I will dig a little bit more into some of the findings of this analysis. And with this first slide, I would like to reiterate what already came out from the discussion so far in the presentation. In terms of an alarming trend, we see that there is a deterioration of acute food insecurity. And this especially when we look at the same 39 countries that were analyzed across the 5 years of the production of the global report on food crisis. As you see from the slide, this trend is shown both in terms of absolute numbers. So you see that from 2016, it goes from 94 million to 147 million in 2020. And at the same time, this is confirmed when we look at the prevalence of the population in crisis or worse. So going from 13% to 21% of the population. So overall, I would say that this slide points very much to a worsening of the food insecurity situation in some countries and contexts. Domenica already presented some of the crises where there was an increase of these figures, and especially due to the protracted or intensifying conflict and insecurity, but also to a combination of drivers, including the incidence of COVID-19 related measures, which had an exacerbating effect on existing vulnerabilities. So let me now pass to these other slides, because still talking about major food crisis, we have noticed in 2020 that 66% of the global number, so of the 155 million people, is concentrated in 10 countries or contexts, for a total of 103 million people in IPC crisis or above. Other important elements that I want to highlight in this slide is that for the third consecutive year, we see that 3 conflict-affected countries, and so DRC, Yemen, and Afghanistan, have the largest population in crisis or worst conditions. And second, again, in terms of prevalence, looking so at the percentage of the population analyzed, being in IPC phase 3 or above, we see that countries like Afghanistan, South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and Zimbabwe have above 40% of their population, or at least 40%. But here, even more concerning are these crises at the bottom of the slides, which have over half of their population in these acute food insecurity conditions. So I think that with this, I'll pass now to another very concerning finding, which is the population in emergency. So in total, we have 28 million people in 38 countries that faced this condition in 2020. And we see that this is really the extremely critical situation in terms of acute food insecurity. This total number shows an increase from 2019. And the major increases at country level were found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, and Sudan. Here, I want to point to the fact that alone, these 3 countries had half of this population in phase 4. So 40 million only in these 3 countries. I think that that's particularly important. Also, in the pie chart, you can see that in 8 countries or territories, there was above 1 million people facing emergency conditions. So in this next slide, I show you really which are these countries and the specific figures. But again, I want to point to a few elements. One is that these 8 countries accounted for 75% of the total population in emergency. And again, in terms of prevalence, you see that 6 countries have above 10% of their population in emergency. Lastly, just let me say that the majority of this context with the IPC or cadre harmonisé phase 4 are conflict affected countries, or insecurity and conflict are really among the primary drivers of this situation. Now, looking also at the most severe phase of the IPC and the cadre harmonisé, catastrophe conditions were observed in 3 countries in 2020. South Sudan, Yemen, and Burkina accounted for 133,000 people. And again, I would like to point to the fact that this food crisis in these countries are mainly due to conflict and insecurity in a context of displacement and also limited humanitarian access. Now, also, you see from this slide, projections are also pointing to the deteriorating or worsening trends. But now, finally, with this last slide, I want to show that since the publication of the global report, the outlook for 2021 is already very alarming, and so points again to a worsening of the situation, and some countries also showing population in phase 5. And so we have here on the slide, Madagascar with 28,000 people in the Grand Sud in catastrophe conditions, and Ethiopia Ethiopia with 350,000 people in catastrophe condition that are expected also to increase. And so here, of course, the situation is also due to the effects of conflict. So elevated population displacement, 1.7 million people displaced, that most of them are in the Tigray region. And movement restriction, limited humanitarian access, also coupled with food production losses and market dysfunctions are behind these numbers. Finally, just one word more. For any further information, you can find these publications for more details, of course, on this website. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Domenica and Lavinia, for presenting, actually, I would say, beautifully presenting these facts. But of course, they're very worrisome trends and facts that we've seen and that we are expecting also for 2021. So I guess now is a good time to move to, so what is our responsiveness to crises, and how can we build resilience against these crises so we can revert these trends and avoid seeing famines in the future. So let me first turn to our first keynote speaker, Giampiero Muzzi, who is a Senior Policy Officer of the Sustainable Agri-Food System and Fisheries Director General at the Director General for International Partnerships of the European Commission, to precisely talk about what is the food crisis responsiveness and the role of the global network against food crises. Giampiero, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much to Domenica and Lavinia for this presentation. Now, clearly, the global report indicates that hunger continues to hit the most fragile contexts and the most vulnerable social groups. Of course, we are concerned with this situation. We were also particularly concerned by the fact that 39 countries out of the 55 that are in the Global Report 2021 have been in food crisis in all the 5 years since the Global Report was first published in 2017. So clearly there is something structurally wrong, as 70% of food crises in 2020 are the same ones as those in 2016. We do have a common understanding of the root causes, conflict, climate change, extreme weather events, economic shocks compounded by the COVID-19. So the challenge is how to reverse these long-term trends to prevent a worsening food crisis in the future. I want to spend a few words on what the EU is doing, the efforts of the European Union. In the European Union, we have a new policy framework, the European Green Deal, which is a roadmap to a green, sustainable and inclusive recovery in the EU and beyond the European Union. We have a farm to fork strategy, which sets a transformational agenda for sustainable agri-food systems. These two policies are informing our ongoing programming exercise. All our delegations and headquarters, we are right now engaged into the programming of the 2021-2027 period. And I want just to mention a few of our priorities, our spending targets. We have a 30% spending target related to climate change, 20% spending target for human development, 10% on migration, and all of this with a strong focus on gender and youth. Now, there are several building blocks in the action, in the engagement of the European Union. I want just to quickly mention 3 of these building blocks. The first one is to promote sustainable agri-food systems. The transition to sustainable agri-food systems has one key objective of social sustainability, which means achieving food and nutrition security and resilience to food crisis. As Team Europe, we have already committed close to 40 billion euro to help our partners dealing with social and economic consequences of the pandemic. The second building block relates to multilateralism, continuing to work with multilateral actors and partners. We look forward in particular to very important multilateral events in the next future, this year Food System Summit in September, the Nutrition for Growth Summit in December, but also the COP15 on biodiversity, the COP26 on climate change, the G7 and the G20 processes. And the third pillar, last not least, effective humanitarian development and peace nexus. I want just to recall that the Global Network Against Food Crisis was created specifically for this purpose back in 2016 by our visionary leaders. Actually, they came together in 2016 and actually they were able to break silos. When it comes to the Global Network Against Food Crisis, I want just to highlight 3 priorities that we see as European Union for the engagement of the global network in the next future, in the coming months. The first one relates to the global report against on food crisis. Sorry. This is a flagship publication of the global network, and I should say one of its major achievements. Since 2016, this report has provided a transparent, consensus-based global picture of food crisis through a process that involves now 16 partners. It is facilitated by the Food Security Information Network, which is based at WFP headquarters in Rome. Now, these 55 countries that are reported in the Global Report 2021, they absorb 97% of food-related humanitarian aid. So this shows that the targeting of the Global Report is correct. So what is the priority? The global network must consolidate this achievement, taking up recent challenges, for example, lack of data and lack of access in many areas, but also exploiting new opportunities, new technologies, innovative techniques for data collection. And most important, it must continue to speak with one voice, providing a joint needs assessment as a public good. The second priority for the global network, the global network must contribute to very ambitious outcomes from the multilateral events ahead of us. I refer in particular to the UN Food System Summit in September. We are happy to see that already the global network is engaged, is supporting the national dialogues, particularly in very fragile countries. And in our vision, we see the global network becoming a game changer, and in perspective, an effective coalition and a key player at the Food System Summit, but of course, beyond and after the Food System Summit, deepening the engagement at country level, including through anticipatory action and long-term cooperation between humanitarian, development, and peace-building actors. Third priorities for the global network, last not least. The global network should consolidate what we call normally the third pillar, the beyond food dimension. So that means deepening the knowledge on the links between the food driver and other drivers of complex crises, and to use its convening power to keep very high in the international agenda the commitment to fight food crisis, famine, and ultimately to achieve SDG 2, zero hunger. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giampiero, for showing us what the global network is prioritizing to do, and it's heartening to see the stepping up the action in a concerted way. Let's hope this will indeed help move things in the right direction and make us more resilient, and make particularly the vulnerable population more resilient against food crisis. Now that same topic, I'm now very honored and pleased to welcome Jim Barnard, the head of the Bureau of Resilience and Food Security of USAID, to give us some of the insights and the priorities of the work undertaken by USAID. Jim, you have the floor.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks to Dominica and Lavinia for excellent presentations. You said, Rob, and it's great to be following Jean-Pierre. I found his comments quite interesting. I'm actually pleased to be able to spend this time with you at the launch of the report and acknowledge the work of the organizations that have collected the data. As USAID is an organization that is built on maximum effectiveness of taxpayer resources, it's critical that we have objective, quantified data upon which to make the best decisions for how we allocate resources. And certainly we feel that this coalition that brings together these groups on the data issues is absolutely fundamental to us maximizing our decision making. Particularly, it's important that we separate the collection of the data from the implementation of the solutions. And when you can separate that so that not the same organizations are seeking are giving you data and also seeking funds to solve the data is really important. So thank you very much for this, and we're very pleased to be supportive of the coalition. This is the type of data for us that's going to provide the decision-making for levels of support for places like the Tigray region of Ethiopia, where, as you saw earlier, currently 350,000 people are currently facing famine. And it also helps us with Yemen, it helps us with South Sudan and Northeast Nigeria. We're also concerned as well about the worsening levels of emergency food insecurity in so many other countries in the regions, like the Northern Triangle, where our administrator, Samantha Power, is visiting this week. She's doing this right now and looking at our food security programs. And all of these countries require immediate attention to prevent worsening disasters and help us all save lives. And the trend is simply going in the wrong direction. Historically speaking, we've always worked to support families hit by crises with opportunities to protect their lives, livelihoods, and assets. And what we're doing differently in our Bureau for Resilience and Food Systems is bringing a systems approach to help communities and nations break the vicious cycle of crises and sustainably reduce poverty and hunger. And it's, as Jean-Pierre just noted, these same countries continually face these crises. It is not something that's going to be solved with a humanitarian approach. It has to be a systemic look at the entire food system from start to finish, from the seed to the plate. And we have to figure out where the gaps are and address that. And so from life-saving assistance to new seeds that provide higher yields, digital innovations that help farmers work smarter and see climatic disasters coming, we know that assistance in food security and agriculture works, particularly because agriculture is the backbone of so many economies around the world. But as we've seen over the last year, agriculture is influenced by external factors that we can't control, like conflict that devastate harvest seasons, pandemics that close borders and affect trade for farmers, and on top of it, on ever worsening climate disasters that wipe out crops. And when these stressors compound on each other, families are left with few options. And that's why at USAID, we've made some substantive shifts to integrate resilience and adaptation programming into all of our portfolios, to protect decades of development progress, reduce chronic vulnerability and the need for humanitarian assistance, and help families bounce back from shocks and stresses. We do all of this with an emphasis on ensuring those who may have been left out of development, and particularly in the near future, but also further back in the past. And we're engaged with activities including women, youth, and marginalized groups. And it's a firm commitment and priority of the Biden-Harris administration. We know that resilient people, households, and communities can retain assets and savings that would otherwise be lost during disaster and conflict. And they're also less likely to require humanitarian assistance too. In fact, we found that every dollar we invest in adaptation and resilience saves $3 in humanitarian assistance when a crisis does strike. Resilience programming isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. We began promoting the significance of resilience with USAID's Feed the Future initiative and the release of USAID's resilience policy in 2012. And that came on the heels of addressing droughts in dry in dry pastoralist and agriculture areas of East and West Africa, and famine in parts of Somalia. Our Feed the Future Innovation Labs created a drought-resistant strain of maize that helped farmers maintain high crop yields despite high temperatures and less rain. And we've heard firsthand from families that resilience programming has made a difference when they experience hardships. Like Haptamu Araga, he and his wife live in the Shakron Ethiopian highlands. They were recipients of a few of USAID's programs, which provided them with links to markets and financial services. They were able to graduate from the Ethiopian government safety nets because of these services. And when their family was caught in drought in 2015, their progress was not hindered. Quite the contrary, they doubled their earnings again 3 years later. But ever since we connected with this family a few years ago, we've seen a lot of new threats come to the forefront. And we've had to adapt and broaden our understanding of the risks faced in these countries on the front end of disasters. Well-being and hunger are increasingly at risk, as we see in this year's global report, due to conflict, climate change, and COVID-19's economic effects. These compounding challenges are daunting, but we are hopeful for the future because of our history of proven results and an agency structure that's conducive for addressing challenges. Because of USAID's efforts to build resilience through the Feed the Future initiative, an estimated 5.2 million families did not go to bed hungry between 2011 and 2017. And more recently, we saw from survey data that households living in the Feed the Future zones of influence in Uganda and Malawi were more resilient to economic impacts of COVID-19 than households living outside of those areas. The Bureau that I oversee, the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, works hand in hand with our USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Our joint response and programming in these fragile contexts strengthens resilience in communities that are at risk of recurrent crisis. And we're excited to have our new administrator, Samantha Power, as she champions human dignity above all and encourages us to focus on our work with the most vulnerable. So with her leadership, we look forward to USAID's continued engagement with the Global Network Against Food Crises and supporting the formation of a coalition focused on hunger and conflict for the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit. To take a moment, this coalition, from my perspective, is going to promote better coordination programming between humanitarian and development efforts in areas prone to crisis. And the coalition and its objectives will be among the US government's top priorities for building resilient food systems during our participation in the summit this fall. And to follow up on Jean-Pierre's point, we do think it's critical that as we go into the summit, we think about opportunities for countries to think through the best ways to address climate change conflict and COVID as in a systems approach, in a way that works best with their current situation. I'll pause there and hand it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. Very important statements you made, and I think particularly take-home messages that we need a systems approach and we need to mainstream resilience in all of our programming and responses. And humanitarian assistance, while important for immediate response, will not be enough to address the longer-term crisis as we're facing them today. And you also give some concrete examples of how resilience could be built. So let's take us these messages forward onto our panel. And understand that, Jim, you may not have the time to join us for the rest of the session, but thank you very much for your remarks, and hopefully to the extent you can stay, you can further pick up on the discussion. So let me introduce the panel. We're running a bit late in the schedule, but let's hear from our 6 panelists, experts in the field. We'll start in the following sequence with Tanya Boudreau, who's the Deputy Chief Party for Analysis of FuseNet, then followed by Clemens Breisinger, who's IFPRI's team leader for the Middle East and North Africa, and subsequently followed by David Elfer, who's the Conflict and Violence Prevention Integrator of the Bureau of Conflict Prevention of USAID. He is being followed by Arif Hussain, the Chief Economist and Director of Research and Assessment and Monitoring of the World Food Programme, Martin van Nieuwkoop, the Global Director of Agriculture and the Food Global Practice, who will give the perspective from the World Bank, and last but not least, Dominique Bourgeon, the Director of the FAO in Geneva and formerly also the Director of Emergencies of FAO. So before starting the discussion, I'm a reminder to all of you that we'd like to hear from you, as you can participate in the Q&A session that will follow, and you can submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and by using hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So let me start with you, Tanya. Over the past few months, food prices have risen to their highest levels in years, especially in low-income countries. It is affecting many of the vulnerable in the food crisis countries as well. So how important is food price monitoring, FuseNet's early warning systems, and did the recent food price spike come on as a surprise, or would you could you anticipate this early on? And what other drivers of acute food insecurity over the past decade most consistently have been on FuseNet's radar, and what are the implications of the answers to the above for resilience planning and programming more broadly? Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to IFPRI for organizing this important event. The simple answer to your first question is that food price monitoring is a critical and core part of FuseNet's monitoring system, but I would stress that it is only one of the many components linked to acute food insecurity that we monitor. We monitor more than just food prices because we know that poor households depend on a range of things beyond food purchases to meet their minimum needs. So, for example, the pie charts on the screen in front of you sum up data for poor households across almost 250 rural livelihood zones in Africa. And they show that poor households generally rely on two main sources of food. They either produce it themselves or they buy it from the market. And we are especially interested at FuseNet in where households are getting the cash income they need to buy that food, which is shown on the pie chart on the right. This has been a major issue during COVID because a lot of the typical off-farm sources that households rely on, like casual labor and self-employment, were undermined during the pandemic. And we worry about this effective demand side of the equation just as much as we do the food price side. So food price monitoring is important to us because it helps us track the cost of the purchase component. But just as important is the range of other monitoring streams, such as the demand for casual labor, cash crop prices, livestock prices, and crop production. And to see where food price monitoring fits in, it might be helpful to understand the analytical framework we use at FuseNet, which is based on a fairly simple formula. We evaluate the current and future risk of food insecurity by tracking the location, the magnitude, and the duration of different hazards, including natural hazards like droughts and floods, as well as man-made hazards like conflict and market shocks. And we interpret the household impact of those hazards in the context of different livelihood systems. So the price monitoring we do is linked to the hazards component of the equation, since every hazard or combination of hazards has its own unique set of supply and demand effects. But we're actually most interested in understanding the downstream effects of these price changes on household food security. So getting back to the second part of your question, you asked whether the recent food price spike came as a surprise or if we could anticipate this early on. I would say that FuseNet even before COVID-19, we were anticipating price increases in a number of countries, which are shown on this slide. The macroeconomic context in these countries worried us even before COVID, and it worries us today. We are anticipating elevated prices throughout 2021 in line with projections from other institutions, and this is based on our read of production and the aggregate availability of key staple foods globally. So you also asked what other drivers of acute food insecurity over the past decade have been most consistently on FuseNet's radar. And the map on this slide shows areas where we have seen high levels of acute food insecurity on a fairly consistent basis. You'll see that conflict is one of the key drivers of acute food insecurity in FuseNet's geographies, and conflict coupled with weather shocks and poor macroeconomic conditions is a really toxic mix. We've seen over the course of just a few months, livelihoods in Tigray get decimated by conflict. And this was a region that over the past decade had become one of the more resilient areas in Africa due to careful international investment and government support. It takes a long time to build resilience and next to no time for conflict to wipe out these gains, as we've seen. Of course, drought is another key driver, particularly in cases where we have multiple years of drought, like in southern Madagascar. And what are the implications of this all for resilience planning and programming more broadly? Well, I would make a couple of points here. Clearly, in areas where we see acute food insecurity outcomes on a regular basis, it would make sense to consider targeting resilience programs. These are areas where there's a frequent occurrence of hazards, and the particular livelihood systems at play in these areas combine to create particularly poor food access problems. As Jim Barnhart mentioned, every US dollar invested in building people's resilience is likely to result in up to $3 in reduced humanitarian assistance and avoided losses. So clearly it makes sense to invest in these particular areas where we've seen multiple years of acute food insecurity. And finally, the last point I would make is that we know the best early warning depends on very specific understandings of local livelihoods, and I believe that this principle also applies to good resilience planning. A one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to succeed, so it's critically important to customize and calibrate resilience programming with local context and livelihood systems in mind. Thank you all, and over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for explaining FuseNet's approach. And we've come a long way in designing much better early warning systems. Yeah, as you mentioned, how then to link them to resilience building responses, that's still where we need to do a lot more work. So let me turn to Clemens Breisinger, particularly to talk maybe about more specific interventions and country context. So for instance, Yemen was one of the 3 countries facing famine, and about 13.5 million people are facing crisis level or worse acute food insecurity. Now, your team has been looking at cash transfer programs, particularly in conflict situations, including in Yemen. So are these programs really helping attenuate situations like that in Yemen? And how can social protection programs form a bridge between emergency relief for more lasting solutions to food insecurity in conflict-ridden countries, including Yemen? And what lessons can we draw from that? Over to you, Clemens.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and many greetings from Egypt to everyone. Yeah, I'll focus my talk on the role of cash transfer in conflict settings, and I'll try to touch upon your questions, Rob, as much as possible. Okay, let's start by asking, what do we know about cash transfers? First of all, cash is obviously fungible. So it allows purchasing wider variety of food items, and that's good for dietary diversity in general. Cash can also be used for non-food purchases. Sometimes people may need to pay for transport, health, or even start investing in small productive assets. Recent research by IFPRI colleague Sikandra Kurdi and her team has found that cash and behavioral change communication during the civil war in Yemen also benefits children. It increases child dietary diversity and height for age among the poorest households. And that means long-term benefits, allowing a generation born during conflict to actually prosper in their adult lives. Now, this research also finds that cash also reduces reliance on borrowing and selling assets during conflicts, which is very important for longer-term resilience. Now, cash also allows for significant cost savings compared to in-kind assistance for large-scale programs due to lower administrative costs. There are also indirect market benefits. Think of the multiplier effects that we always talk about, where the cash helps the local economy to grow. Some estimates suggest that the benefit is $2 per $1 provided to beneficiaries. Now, also that's something not many people think about, but it's increasingly important. Cash-based delivery can also be a way of strengthening local institutions. In some countries, mechanisms for cash delivery exist pre-conflict. Think of pension systems in some countries. Using and expanding such mechanisms during conflict can help longer-term institution building. A good example for this is the Social Welfare Fund in Yemen. Now, of course, there are also challenges for cash in conflict settings. Markets may not be working very well, or supply chains may be disrupted by conflict. There are also some concerns that the cash lands in the wrong hands. In any case, the fact is that in-kind assistance still dominates in many places. In Yemen, for example, it's estimated that currently less than 20% of the support to households is actually in cash. Now, let me share some thoughts and recommendations. First of all, there is a lot of scope to move towards more cash assistance. And this recommendation is also part of the 2016 Grand Bargain Agreement between some of the largest donors and humanitarian organizations, many of them with us in the virtual room today. But moving more to cash as a major delivery modality needs feasibility checks. Are there actually operating markets? How is the cash being delivered? Are we targeting the right people? These are just some of the important questions that we need to answer. In that sense, the Grand Bargain explicitly also mentions more data-driven delivery of humanitarian aid and better coordination. So my hope, and actually my suggestion, is that as one of the outcomes of this seminar, we all further explore opportunities to expand our efforts on jointly producing more evidence in conflict settings to further improve the effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian aid. Now, producing rigorous evidence in conflict setting is not easy, and that's why not a lot of it is out there, but it is possible. Data collection is becoming easier. Think of phone surveys. We have more and more statistics from space. We also have information from mobile phone operators, just to name a few new opportunities that are out there. Now, all the institutions gathered here in this meeting have unique comparative advantages, ranging from on-the-ground logistics and beneficiary databases to financial resources and research capabilities. I'm convinced that together we can continue to make a positive difference. Let me conclude by saying that moving more to cash in more places is important, but it's not a substitute for infrastructure investments and institution building. We estimate, for example, that Yemen's economy contracted by over 36% over the past few years, crops and livestock sectors by even more. Poverty stands at 80%, rural poverty up to 90%. That means we also need to focus on economic growth, and our research shows that especially agri-food system-led growth is effective on the path to recovery in countries like Yemen. And perhaps most critically, post-conflict reconstruction needs a strong focus on policies and local institution building. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clemens. That was very clear. So you've shown that social protection can be a good instrument to build resilience and protect people against food crisis, but also it needs careful design. So we don't know exactly what works best in each context, and it needs to be aligned with a range of other interventions at the same time. And that feeds back to Jim Barnett's point on sort of more systemic approach to these issues, but also what can be done in order to prevent conflict also more directly. And that takes me to David Elfer of the USAID Bureau of Conflict Prevention. So the report emphasizes that conflict remains the main driver of the most severe food crisis. So it's aside from the things we can do, but it maybe not enough is done by way of conflict prevention in the support we provide to countries. So how can efforts be turned much more into preventative actions that can build resilience against crisis? And what is USAID doing to align short-term humanitarian relief and longer-term development assistance along the lines of what Jim Barnett introduced by way of concept? Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. And I'm thrilled to be here. It's an honor. I'm thrilled to see this report as well, although the findings are so grim. I'm going to take a moment to foot stomp that nexus between food insecurity and conflict. That yes, conflict is both a major cause of as well as a result of food insecurity, and the conditions surrounding this are extremely dynamic and complex. So we need very, very local definition of what we do from here. Rapid shifts in food availability or prices can trigger unrest and heighten intergroup tensions. Conflict disrupts food distribution networks and economic systems and the livelihoods needed to secure food access. Food itself frequently becomes a weapon in conflict, with structural denial of supplies and territory to one party by another, or through destruction of fields, crops, and livestock. All of these factors can increase tension and provide flashpoints for both structural and physical violence, which in turn compound assistance challenges. So it's critical to plan for for this nexus and against such consequences proactively. And that's the programmatic context we're all working in. So how can our efforts be turned to prevention and resilience? The good news is that building resilience against crises like these involves looking through a conflict-focused lens and making good use of a particular toolkit more than it does replacing food security programs with something new and different, or altering the basic nature of food security programming, or adding new layers of administration and implementing requirements on top of implementing partners. So an example, USAID has a definition of resilience with regard to food security, which is largely technical. It's focused on markets, systems of production and distribution. The conflict prevention field, on the other hand, looks at resilience in terms of people and politics. It's about the ability of social groups and systems of governments to withstand shocks, to find ways to come together when under stress, instead of splitting apart or turning on each other. And that shift in perspective is critical in this case for all the reasons I mentioned before about conflict as a cause and result of food insecurity. This isn't a nexus we can get away from. Conflict is about people and politics. It arises within and between social groups. Populations in these contexts are badly traumatized, more often than not. Recognizing resilience as a social issue also urges us to look for those places where trauma-aware programming is necessary, both in the short term and because it will help ease that transition from humanitarian relief to longer-term development. Unless we deal with those psychosocial aspects of the populations we work within, we're missing a lot of risks, but we're also missing opportunities to leverage our projects to even greater good. And once we view resilience this way, we see the minefields and the opportunities differently, the socio-political landscape differently, and we're able to divine how we do this in a more appropriate kind of way. Altering the way we do business in such contexts is all about how implementers see the conditions around them and how implementers move within them. It allows implementers to view their operations in such unstable places as part of and influencing those dynamic contexts, the conflict itself, and thus to act on the need to be intentional about approaching both risks and opportunities, using all available tools to pivot and adapt when circumstances merit, helping to ensure that interventions have their intended effects. Case in point, that conflict-sensitive lens includes continual analysis and monitoring, flexible systems design, adaptive management, and monitoring, evaluation, and learning that incorporates conflict-sensitive indicators. These are tools that we have and can use them right now, even if future iterations of them will be more effective. Another example, procurement reform has meant there's ever more flexibility available in funding so that programs aren't locked into fixed patterns, but can pivot and adapt to changing circumstances as they appear. The dynamic nature of conflict means those pivots will be necessary. We know that for a fact. Yes, more of that flexibility is needed. Not every funding mechanism used in conflict-affected areas has the necessary levels of it, but we're getting there. Building on those opportunities, that's the core of strengthening resilience, fostering collaboration, and mitigating the risks of future conflict and violence. Now, one constant long-term answer is we are doing more research, more analysis, and more assessment. We have a great deal of this already, but we need more. We need to operationalize it more effectively. I do want to note, though, that this is pretty much a boilerplate answer. Yes, we do need more because that's the only way we keep evolving programs to new levels, but it's also important to note that when you hear people like me say things like that, more assessment, more research, more analysis, you're hearing a social scientist for whom there is never any such thing as enough research, analysis, and assessment. There's the boilerplate part. We know a great deal already. We have more than enough to act on, and that lens, those existing tools that I mentioned, they're tried and tested at this point. Doing it is challenging. This is not easy stuff, but the changes and leaps forward have really come when we had the will to act on them, and that's what it takes in situations like this. So what are we doing to align short-term relief with long-term development? The major key to this is recognizing that the linkage between those two things is peace. The major breakdown between those two things is conflict. Once we get ourselves properly focused on that as a bridge, and it's not the only bridge, as other presenters have pointed out, these are dynamic systems. There is no one single answer. There's no panacea here. But this is necessary, if not sufficient. We can't do it without recognizing this. The instrumental how, the activity how, flows from there. We're not talking about a technical answer. We're talking about a peace-building answer. USAID is also, and this is a shameless plug here, building the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention within the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. This is a far more operational body than its predecessor, the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, was. And we can provide technical assistance across the spectrum of USAID programming, as well as analysis and assessment that will help identify both those areas of resilience to build on and fragilities that need addressing. We can help ensure that programs recognize and understand the social and political dynamics of conflict so as to correct for them and build peace where that's possible. But at the very least, also recognize where USAID assistance may contribute to friction or conflict and to avoid having that effect. So I will leave it there for now and turn it back over to you, Rob. Happy to take any questions after this.
No, thank you very much, David, and also laying out the complexities of even if we know how to act on the ground, it may be difficult to implement if we can't break through the particular political and community conflict situation. So it's very important to press harder in trying to break through those complexity to get through those complexities and translate what we know into concrete action. Let me turn now to Arif Hussain, who's the chief economist of the World Food Programme. Arif, the World Food Programme warned last year that COVID-19 could push another 130 million people into crisis-level acute food insecurity. Although the numbers we've seen and heard are very alarming, the report does not indicate such a large increase. Does it mean you were too pessimistic, or aren't we looking at all the food crisis context that you referred to when you made that estimate last year? What does it mean for what we need to do in terms of improve our monitoring capacity? But maybe also turning to the solutions from what we heard from Tanya and Clemens in particular. So how is the food price increase that we've seen recently affecting the WFP's response capacity? And what does it mean in terms also for the design of the cash transfer program that WFP is also working on in many food crisis contexts? Over to you, Arif.
Thanks, Rob. Hello, everyone. No, thank you for this this question. I really appreciate being here, and also all the good comments and remarks which have been made so far. What I would like to say is that you know, Global Report on Food Crisis is an excellent report. We have been part of that for the last five years. It has the consensus, and it's a flagship report. There's no doubt about it. But the one thing which is different is that this is only covering 55 countries. Now, if it was business as usual, like Jean-Pierre was saying, it's 97% of external assistance, 55 countries, that would be great. But unfortunately, 2020 was not business as usual. And there was more poverty, there was more hunger in the countries, you know, as well as in other countries. So us as WFP, we had to analyze all the countries where we are present. So we had to look at, instead of 55 countries, we were looking at the whole scale of our operations, which was about 80 countries. So that's where the difference comes from. So that was one thing. The second thing which Dominica was saying was that IPC, sometimes it doesn't cover the full country. It covers locations and people, ranging anywhere from 4%, 3% of a country to 100% of a country. When we did the simulations for COVID, we were covering the entire country, urban, rural. And also the third part, which was different, is that Global Report on Food Crisis does not cover refugee populations or displaced populations in that sense, refugee populations. We cover that. So when you put all of this together, you will obviously see a big difference. And that is true today. I mean, we have done out of these, you know, our initial projections were based, other than the simulations, but countries' assessments in the start were based on less than 20. Right now we have over 50 assessments, and our results are holding quite good. So we feel quite comfortable about that. My thing is that if we are going to go into these types of situations anytime, you know, more, what we need to do is to have a situation where we can provide these projections at the global level. And that has happened. So I will give you an example of, maybe Martin will talk about it, where World Bank did extreme poverty simulations, which showed 143 to 163 million more people entering extreme poverty. FAO did on chronic hunger, which came up from up to 132 million people in chronic hunger. So if extreme poverty and chronic hunger are increasing by the same 130 plus million people, how can acute be less? I mean, logically, it doesn't make sense. So there is this, you know, what the beauty here is that there is a lot of convergence in the global figures. So there is no really a conflict or a disagreement. It's just that Global Report on Food Crisis is about 55 countries, and this problem is bigger than 55 countries. That's simple. Now, coming to the second part, which is obviously very worrying for us, is the rising prices. As you can see, I mean, right now we have prices at the levels of 2011. That was when Arab Spring happened. We are worried about two things. When prices go up, they affect our beneficiaries. People need more assistance for longer periods of time because of affordability issues. But also our purchasing power goes down because last year we bought about $1.7 billion of food, about 3 million tons. And, you know, if prices are up by 30, 40%, I mean, you're gonna see that on our side. So we get in a situation where we buy less if the monies are held at the same level and the needs go up. The second thing and the last point I want to make is about, you know, 2008 food and fuel crisis, it was about the price effect. Prices were going up. 2011, it was again still price effect. Prices were going up. Income effect was constant. There was no income effect. People's jobs weren't lost. This time around, we are seeing both at the same time. So you have the prices going up, and at the same time, people's incomes have been decimated. ILO last estimate was about $3.7 trillion less in income. So when you combine the two, you see who's going to be suffering. I think we are looking at a situation which going forward where needs are way, way, way up, the resources available to address those needs is way, way, way lower. And hence, every dollar needs to be spent to its fullest potential, optimal use, whatever, however you want to say it. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. And yeah, it was clearly the challenges that are there for the people, also the challenge for WFP in providing assistance, particularly with rising food prices. So let's hope we can get and step up the response capacity soon. Let me now turn to Martin van Nieuwkoop, who's the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. So we've been looking at, and mentioned several times, the protected situations of food crisis, particularly in situation of conflict and civil strife. So what can you say about the insights from the World Bank on what's constraining development and perpetuating conflict and fragile situations in these contexts, and what contributions development of the food system can make in overcoming these hurdles? And also maybe you could say a bit more about what financing instruments the World Bank has in its toolkit to address food crisis in these fragile and conflict affected situations. Over to you, Martin.
Very good. Thank you very much, Rob, and very pleased to be part of this panel and a very important subject, of course. Yeah, I think in response to your first question, I mean, what do we know? We're about to come up with a new paper as part of the bank's Future of Food series, I mean, titled Building Stronger Food Systems in Fragile Conflict and Violence Situation. And that paper actually points out, I mean, that sustained development in FCV countries is constrained. And of course, we know that by multiple interlocking characteristics, poor governance, weak institutional capacity, lack of state legitimacy, low social cohesion, inadequate security, high exposure to climate shocks, undeveloped private sector, significant internal displacement. I can go on and on. But food crises that feed into reinforcing a vicious circle, and that gets us to those protracted situations that Joe was talking about in his introduction. Now, considering that the food system is the largest private segment and provider of jobs in FCV countries, the paper that puts forward, I mean, that food systems can help reduce conflict and improve social cohesion, and therefore food security needs to be seen as a foundational element of poverty reduction in these contexts. Now, and then more specifically, what would be the entering points for the food systems to play this role? And four areas are put forward. I mean, first is that that the governance and institutional capacity can be strengthened, by building accountability, transparency, predictability, and objective targeting in the food distribution, food for work, cash for work programs, and other agriculture subsidy programs that are out there, and by involving and strengthening community-based organizations and institutions in these efforts. And second, I mean, job creation can be promoted through agribusiness development. I mean, with support focusing on inclusive business models, building and protecting capital stock in food systems, I mean, strengthening skills, improve access to finance, including with a role to play for political risk insurance. A third entry point is that conflict risks and shock and environmental fragility can be reduced by supporting resilient and sustainable resource management, particularly access to and use of land and water among herders and crop producers, which often can be a very important source of conflict, and with a specific attention to land administration. And fourth, of course, is a need to adequate prevention and response to food crisis. And this can be ensured by supporting early warning systems, improving crops and livestock resilience to pest diseases, droughts, and floods, etc., etc. Now, the second part of your question, what financing instrument does the bank have? I mean, of course, we have our regular financing. And what you see is that, at around the food price crisis, 2007, 2008, the bank provided about $4 billion a year for food and nutrition security. Over time, it has increased to last year 14 billion, and now it's projected this year and next to get to around $17 billion per year. Now, what you see is also a very significant increase in FCV countries. At the time of the food price crisis, our financing was about $250 million per year. Last year, it was 2 billion, and now we're getting to 3 billion. And these projects that we're financing cover many of the elements, that I just mentioned in the first answer, the answer to your first question. And many of these projects also have contingency emergency response components. So when a crisis hits, so those projects are addressing the medium to long-term drivers, but when a crisis hits, this contingency funding under those components can be mobilized. And this has been an important part of the bank's response to rising food insecurity as part of COVID-19. A second instrument relates to the early response financing mechanism under the crisis response window of IDA, which is the bank's soft loan arm for the poorest country. And this mechanism provides contingency financing to countries facing health and food crisis, food security emergencies. And the total envelope that was allocated to this last year when IDA 19 became effective was $1 billion. Now, so based on FuseNet data, that food insecurity projections are being done for quite a number of IDA countries. Those are generated on a regular basis. And then, focusing on when countries move from IPC 2 to IPC 3. Currently, we have about 13 countries, that have been identified and actually accessing those funds under that mechanism. We think, that financing, focusing on IPC 2 to IPC 3 complements, the humanitarian assistance that normally is focused on IPC 3 plus situation. We have other instruments as well. The Global Concessional Financing Facility, and I can talk about it maybe in more detail in the Q&A. Back to you, Rob.
Many thanks, Martin, and it's good to know these financing instruments that you have developed. So maybe that takes me to Dominique Bourgeon, as the last but not least on this panel, maybe how that could be aligned with the work of the Global Network Against Food Crisis that has been pushing towards integrating humanitarian relief, long-term preventative development action, and peace-building efforts. Now, this agenda was already set in 2016, as Jean-Pierre has indicated, and also taken forward in a high-level event in Brussels 2 years ago to rally support behind that agenda. But clearly, alarming data we've heard, much more is needed. So, Dominique, what in your view are the main bottlenecks to get to more structural solutions, and how effective is the global network in overcoming these bottlenecks? And last, and that also ties in with a few questions that have come already from the audience. What can we expect from the UN Food System Summit in this regard? Over to you, Dominique.
Well, thank you, Rob. And first of all, I would like, of course, to thank IFPRI and you, Rob, in particular for inviting us to what has now become a most expected yearly event. A lot, of course, has already been said, coming as the last speaker, but as previously has been mentioned by some of the other speakers, it's clear that the 2021 edition of the Global Report on Food Crisis, which depicts the global acute food insecurity situation based on high level of consensus among 16 partners, is indeed deeply worrying. In 2020, as was said, the number of people experiencing acute food insecurity has never been as high since we basically started with this global report. Unsurprisingly, the rise in acute hunger has been accompanied by a steady growth in funding for humanitarian assistance in these countries. A recent analysis that was done in the context of the global network shows that between 2016 and 2019, humanitarian assistance to food security in food crisis context rose by almost 25%. However, very little was allocated to agriculture, to the agriculture sector, short and long-term interventions, despite the fact that, as you all know, up to 80% of people in acute food insecurity depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. So this definitely highlights a significant structural problem. But indeed, coming to your question, Rob, what are the key challenges in preventing and addressing food crisis? First, according to us, it is clear that translating humanitarian development peace nexus approaches from theory to practice at country level remains a major challenge, especially in fragile settings. Yes, we are good at piloting. I would say less good at going to scale, even if some key partners, many, I would say, in this virtual room, are now more and more walking the talk. Also, what is very important is that global discussion around the Nexus are too often, I would say, continue to have limited impact frameworks and funding to have a limited impact on frameworks and funding decisions at country level. Different actors have different understanding also of what HDP approach entails, and there are few, if any, coordination mechanisms to support this. Second, national and regional ownership is absolutely key. We must proactively enhance national and regional ownership of efforts to address the root causes of food insecurity. This means, whenever possible, engaging with government and national stakeholders and ensuring the work of international community contributes to the long-term vision that is developed by the countries. Then, as was said by one of the previous speakers, more I think, there is definitely no one size fits all. Only this way we can ensure the sustainability of our intervention. Finally, we need to work more to integrate programs and investments related to food security and agriculture with other relevant sectors. As Giampiero was saying, we need to go beyond food and engage, for example, with peace actors in countries affected by conflict and insecurity. And this is definitely a key endeavor of the global network against food crisis. To come to the second part of your question, what is indeed the role of the global network in all this and the contribution it is bringing to the UNFS related process? As a matter of fact, the vision underpinning the global network is exactly about this. It's about bringing all actors around the broad spectrum around the table to indeed work and to prevent and respond to food crises. In this context, I would say that the global network is clearly seizing the momentum generating by the UN Food System Summit to mobilize partners at all levels, global, regional, and national, to identify and address policy and investment and governance challenges that are preventing governments to indeed go towards sustainable solution to food crisis. At country level, the global network is building capacities and supporting government and local actors to engage with humanitarian and development partners in designing and implementing a current set of country-owned policies. Specifically, efforts are now focusing on facilitating effective national food systems dialogues. These dialogues, we feel, are key entry points for agreeing on food system transformation and pathways to that goal. A key area of work is to enhance, as was said, analytical capacities to make sure that all these decisions are evidence-based. Technical support is also being provided to ensure that all ongoing monitoring and analytical process at country level are coherent and harmonized to indeed inform this dialogue. At the global level, the Food System Summit provides an opportunity to secure and advocate for consensus. Under Action Track 5 of the summit, a potential coalition of partners, as was mentioned by the USAID colleagues, supporting this approach is being established. Building on this, the global network would continue its role as a pivotal global platform for joint consensus-based assessment and joint programming. We see basically the summit as the beginning of our efforts to build resilient food system, and the global network is, of course, clearly committed to support this process in the long term and to support the implementation of the summit recommendation in and by countries. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Dominique, and particularly also elaborating on what the UN Food System Summit can do. And that would also be hopefully a good platform to push this agenda further, and hopefully you can get to better outcomes. Now, I have a bit of a problem since I promised to have some interaction with the audience. We had a little bit because I interjected these questions on the what the UN Food System Summit could do, which you already responded to, Dominique. But in passing, Sylvia have already answered several of the other questions as well. There's still outstanding questions, but since we're running out of time, I apologize for that. So we have to go straight to the concluding remarks. But we will pick up your questions and feed them back to the panelists after this session. So with that, thank all that have submitted questions, and they won't go to waste. We'll take them on board, and as I said, channel them to the panelists. With that, let me give the floor to Jocelyn Brown-Hull, who's the new director of the FAO office in North America, based in Washington, D.C. She just joined the office this week, but before that, she was the deputy regional representative for FAO's regional office for Africa, and within that context, has been face-to-face with many of the food crises that we've been discussing today. So very happy to have you on board, Jocelyn. Over to you. You have the floor.
I am on my third day for the job, and I look forward to meeting everybody as soon as I can here, and also those who are listening in. I got my second Pfizer shot last night, so I am vaccinated, and I look forward to seeing everyone in person. You know, this has been a rich discussion, and I think even for those of us who are steeped in this area, in food insecurity and global prices and global availability of food and conflicts, as we are in FAO and our colleagues in IFPRI, World Bank, WFP, and others, FuseNet, USAID, EU are involved. There's still some really incredible information coming out of this report. I think that understanding where exactly the acute food insecurity is, but also recognizing that the report may not cover everything in terms of the displaced persons and refugees. So data is critical to food insecurity, to combating food insecurity. Sometimes data is not viewed as being that interesting, or it has a little bit less star power than perhaps helicopters or drones flying over and food coming down. But it is really the fundamental part to how we address food insecurity. And so I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and to be able to provide, to just be with these panelists and hear what they had to say about the report. I think we need to think both about, you know, some final remarks, as one size does not fit all. And going to my colleague Dominique's point about we really need to ensure that we have national and regional ownership. I think that's critical, and that's part where each of our organizations does play a role. We also need to be involved with the civil society and the other players to address the conflict issues that are both the cause and the result of food insecurity. So it's a wide array of actors, and I think the Food System Summit coming up this fall will actually spotlight how vast this area is, and how many players that we need to address and stakeholders we need to involve. I was very interested and heartened to hear about issues around supporting resilience and agri-food systems, because the humanitarian assistance, while critical and will remain critical, is costlier. And I think if we could actually spotlight more of the agri-food systems and the resilience programs to prevent food insecurity, I think our finite development dollars will go farther. Finally, as a closing remark, I think all of us involved in the food insecurity world knew once COVID hit that this was not going to be just a public health crisis. This was going to be a food insecurity crisis. And I think, you know, originally last summer, with the way the government's dealt with things and social protection programs, we were able to avoid perhaps more acute food insecurity. And now what we're seeing from this report is that we can't avoid it anymore. I was in Zimbabwe last year. I got actually stuck there for COVID. I was stuck there for 5 months. And, you know, you could see this sort of wave coming on of food insecurity, and now we're realizing it. So it's sobering, but with the joint programming together, the joint emphasis on information, our different programming and what we can do, whether we're on the donor side or we're on the technical assistance side or the humanitarian side, it is really critical that we use this information to program jointly. So with that, hopefully I have not run through my closing remarks too much. And again, I hope to meet everyone in person very soon. Thank you very much for including me.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I think that's good closure of this seminar. And again, I apologize for having not having controlled the time of the panelists sufficiently, but I can't blame them either. There's many questions to them. This is an urgent matter. I think the message is very clear. We need systemic approaches to it, aligning humanitarian systems, development assistance, peace building efforts, and that we need to do together. It's not just a local problem, it's a global problem. And hopefully the UN Food System Summit will take that to heart, and that this seminar has helped to bring that high up to that agenda. So with that, let me thank you all again very much for your contributions, and for the audience for listening, and hopefully this will help finding the right solutions to this urgent humanitarian problem.